Hello, everyone. Today is going to be more recounting specific stories instead of the more traditional linear timeline of events like the past two episodes. As I was writing episode 2, I kept thinking about specific adventures with Harriet that I wanted to recount, but couldn't quite find a way to do so and keep the timeline rolling. So I figured, why not take a whole episode and devote it to my dwarf rogue, and give her feats their chance to shine. So here we go. Video log episode 3, Rogue Tales. So running Scholomance back with a small group of friends I had met in-game. We had a tank, warrior, shadow priest, our healer. I believe for a lot of these we rotated between like a hunter mage for ranged and like a paladin or sometimes a DPS warrior. Man, if I had my screenshots, this would be awesome time to show them, but I don't. So I'm just going off memory. I remember the tank and the healer specifically, ran a ton of dungeons with them. Awesome people. Didn't make life easy with the shadow priest being the healer, and she didn't switch to holy or anything like that, but man, we ran the dungeon, and I remember we beat it many times, but we also didn't get all the way through many times. After wipes, groups would break up. It definitely was not an easy dungeon back then, and this time it was a 5-man. So, as I said, we ran this dungeon quite a bit, and I distinctly remember the one part that I recalled. I was most proud of myself at the time, back then. Sap pulling mobs. And for any of you that don't know, the Rogue CC in vanilla, you had like Blind, which you could use outside of stealth, or it would take you out of stealth. But Sap was your main like pre-combat CC spell. And if you hadn't spec'd into improve Sap, you would break out of stealth every time you use Sap. So Sap pulling is what I'll be referencing this maneuver to, and I'll explain it here in just a moment. So, as I said, what do I mean by sap pulling? So back then, sap broke stealth unless you added points into improved sap. Even after you maxed the talent out, you still had a 10% chance that you would break stealth after a sap. Note, at the time of the story, I hadn't spec'd into improved sap. So I would target the mob closest to the group and furthest from any other mob group in the room, as shown in the diagram on screen. Please excuse the awful paint job, but I'll explain what this mess is in just a moment. As you can see, I would target the mob indicated in yellow and try to sneak up behind it and keep myself in between it and the tank, so I'd have a direct line back to the tank. There was a slight delay once you sapped to when stealth completely broke on your character, and that would give you a few steps to get away from the mob as their angry fellows charged after me. I would make a beeline for the tank and have him clap, taunt, sunder the mobs off of me, or vanish if I needed to after he had aggro. It's very important to make sure he had aggro before I vanished, otherwise the mobs would sometimes, the sapped mob would be unsapped and everybody would just stop where they were and then either run back all the way, or sometimes it was so broken that the mobs would just aggro the nearest person and then you would aggro everyone, and sometimes the sap mob would pull other mobs near them, and it was just a mess. So you had to be careful with your vanishes. I don't remember, going back to the story, I don't honestly recall too much more of Scolo from back then. Scholomance, I refer to it as Scolo. But I really enjoyed the feel of the dungeon and how easy it was to get in over your head if you weren't careful. There was a lot of strategy involved. And in that one, I mean, man, so many times you just had to be careful, pull around corners. If you didn't have corners, just clear rooms. Because if somebody ran the wrong way, somebody had died and had to run back through and just ran too near a mob near a door, they would just pull a whole mob, train people back to you and die. I mean, for a lot of you, you know this, and it's nothing new, but I just want to set kind of the tone for the dungeons back then and how dangerous they were. So that's what I distinctly remember from Scholomance, and I remember doing that in other dungeons as well. But for some reason, that dungeon And those friends, just, that's what I remember. So, next we're going to go into some PvP stories. As you might remember, the Honor System came out with patch 1.4 and launched some of the most epic PvP battles in my WoW experience, personally. I remember, of course, the Terran Mill versus South Shore battles. They were the place to be if you wanted to PvP on my server. It's Feathermoon, role-playing server. Now, as a rogue, the whole point of the class is to strike from the shadows and retreat as soon as you could. You would usually die quickly if you ran into a group of enemies and tried to kill one. Everyone would target you, and you would pop or die really quick. My strategy, when I stuck to it and listened to it and adhered to it, which worked most of the time, sometimes I got a little too anxious. So my strategy was to sit on the flanks or behind the Horde main lines and wait for someone to get low on HP or mana. You could always tell who those people were, not only by targeting them, but because they would run slightly behind or try to hide on the edge of the battle, drinking and eating or bandaging. Those were my targets, because I felt that was a rogue's job, and I was going to do my job to the best of my abilities for my faction. Now, this didn't always turn out as planned, and back then rogues didn't have any anti-magic shell to hide and vanish with. Stone Form on the Dwarf Rogue was excellent for countering poisons and bleed effects. This immunity every few minutes also helped me pick a target, because I would pick a target, I would pounce, hopefully killing the target, and then use Stone Form to clear any dots they had applied to me and vanish or run far enough away to stealth. Sometimes I didn't always have vanish up, so I'd have to like run away and stealth and hope nobody targeted me. And those targets I usually picked were either warriors, which didn't pick very often unless they were already low on health, and other rogues. Hunters sometimes too, because most of their attacks were poisons, at least their dots. So pretty much anyone that Stone Form can clear, they were my priority target if I had a choice. Now, when it came to like warlocks, they were my most hated opponent. I didn't have any way to counter their dots. I couldn't tell you how many times I died trying to run away and re-stealth, only to have a warlock curse me and bring help to finish me off. I remember this one time in particular in Alterac Mountains. I remember that one time in particular I was chased from Terran Mill all the way to the uplands in the Alterac Mountains by a warlock. My vanish had been spoiled by a last-minute curse, and I barely escaped after a long mount chase. It felt like a really long chase, but of course it was probably only a minute or two back then. He had a faster mount than I did, but I don't exactly know how, but I was able to use my carrot on a stick and like the hills and the draw distance to get away. Pretty lucky that his dot ran out before he could reapply it. So I don't recall what happened after, but I clearly never forgot how close I came to being another notch on his stave. There was a guild on the Horde side of the best Horde PvPers that I recall from back then. I believe the guild was called Low Red Moon. They were the most feared Horde guild on the server, at least from what I recall in the forums and in my circle of friends in-game. Whenever one or more of them was spotted, primarily among the combatants at Terran Mill versus South Shore, the Alliance would usually get pushed back in the South Shore. They usually had good gear for their time, Low Red Moon guild members, and a lot of high levels, lots of 60s, pretty early on in the server's lifespan. From what I recall, during the first 6 to 8 months of the game, there were not a ton of 60s on the server, and gearing was pretty much whatever you could find. So I don't recall, I'm sure they happened somewhere, but I don't recall a lot of raids going on. Could be that I was just ignorant of them. I wouldn't be surprised of that. So these seesaw battles between South Shore and Terran Mill would rage for hours, and usually taper off once one side had a large enough advantage in level 50 plus characters to destroy the other side's town. Before Battlegrounds, this was the place to be if you wanted PvP and to level up. You had to be careful, though, because there were dishonorable kills back then, and you had to watch for them, or they would wallop your honor pretty hard. Especially if you were in a group, and one of your group members killed them, you could still get a dishonorable kill, and it still counted against you. So after the first few battles and getting a few dishonorable kills myself, I learned to keep out of the main raid group, and either group with a few friends that I knew wouldn't get dishonorable kills, or more often, go it alone, in true rogue fashion. Now, whenever I wasn't behind enemy lines during these melees, I was usually hanging out near our casters, especially if anybody was complaining about getting ganked. Enemy rogues love to pick off low B and or weakened higher level ranged player characters, much like I used to do, and did, on the Horde. So I would counter gank the gankers. Man, this was fun, but definitely made my heart pound, because while you're waiting for an enemy rogue to strike, you could pass too close to one of them and detect them in stealth, and they could detect you. The latency and the computers of the day usually made this a hit or miss thing. Once I ever heard that stealth sound, I think we all know what that is by now, you would better believe I was pounding my target nearest enemy and the number 4 for cheap shot. I love to open with ambush or garrote, depending on the target back then, but cheap shot was the best way for me that I found back then to open on a enemy rogue or druid. It was just the fastest. You didn't have to be behind them, faced a certain way. You could, anywhere they were standing, you could open on them. Now, if a rogue was already open, or had already opened on a friendly player character, then I would typically open with a garrote or an ambush, depending on their health. And if I thought I could get in a backstab or two and an eviscerate in before they had vanished, now, if I didn't think I could finish them off quickly, or that I would have to, or that they would run and vanish, the sign of an experienced player typically, then I would garrote them. This was an 18-second bleed, and wasn't as common back then as an opener, in my experiences. Most other rogues preferred cheap shot and stun locking you. That bleed, though, kept the enemy rogue from vanishing. They would cast Vanish, and then within 3 seconds reappear because of the dot. And that gave me time to chase them down and apply crippling poison, or another CC effect, like kidney shot, of my own. Now, if they straight up ran away sprinting, and I was quick enough to sprint as well, I could literally just backstab them to death. It wasn't too common, but man, it sure was awesome when it worked. More often than not, though, it came to blows, mano a mano. And I would have to try, as a dagger rogue, to take them down with sinister strikes and or gouge, backstabs, kidney shots. Sometimes I'd rupture, but usually, you know, a sinister striking mace rogue or swords rogue was usually a little better one-on-one. But I also usually would have help from whoever had been ganked, as long as they hadn't died yet. Another, you know, I don't want to say fun experience, but that PvP definitely brought with it was sore losers and winners. I'll give you one good example of a sore loser. I once had a troll rogue so mad at me for repeatedly counter-ganking / hunting him down outside of South Shore that he created a character, Alliance side, just to tell me how unfair I was by waiting for him to attack my allies before attacking him. Pardon me. I replied with something like, well, that is a rogue's job, right? Stay hidden and then strike unseen? He replied with some garbage about fighting fair, which as a rogue you should never do, of course. Running towards an enemy unstealthed in leather was just asking to be killed back then, because we didn't have a lot of good escape options and nothing to close with. As for this guy whining to me about how unfair I was, I eventually ignored him and the other ultimate after that. I don't recall a lot of this happening back then. I'm sure if the PvP servers would have allowed you to create characters on both sides back then, this would have been more common on those realms as well. As for my PvP experience overall, it really kicked into high gear with patch 1.5 in Battlegrounds. Alterac Valley was my favorite, and those epic battles are a great tale for another vlog. I really appreciate you guys listening to this extra long edition, and I hope everyone has a great day. In the next episode, I plan on covering my first Horde level 60 when I re-rolled onto the RP PvP server, the Venture Co., with a friend from Feathermoon. That's it for today, guys. I'll see you next time, and remember, stay positive about Classic WoW. Gaming Pass 30 out.